And for more on the President Obama's Asian tour, Keith Fitz-Gerald joins us live from Baltimore. He's the Chief Investment Strategist with Money Map Press. And welcome to the show, sir. And ahead of Obama's visits, for our viewers who don't know this, there are protests in Tokyo, especially with the labor unions. Basically, the issue is the potential farming deal that could come into place. There's opposition to that. Explain to our viewers what that's about.
Well, it's about really two things. Number one is business as usual, because you're talking about ultra-nationalistic trade sanctions that have been in effect for years and years, primarily agricultural, fisheries, and you're looking at who compromises the vote. The Japanese government is backed by what they call the Liberal Democratic Party. That's roughly 40% farmers and fishery workers. So it's logical that these guys are screaming a lot.
This visit that the president is making, I want to add, by the way, he is stopping in China, but not until later in the year. Details of that are still in the works. But is it significant that he's stopping in Japan first, and then we can get to the other countries?
Well, I wouldn't expect anything less given the length of the U.S.-Japanese relationship or the Japanese-U.S. relationship. We've been mutually dependent on each other for decades. So this is logical to me, although it's highly politically charged, clearly.
The gap between the U.S. and the Japanese government, there's been some talk about specific industries, especially on tariffs. I mean, the U.S., for example, they want to get involved in the auto industry in China, and this is an issue that's been in the works for a long, long time, still unresolved. Might that be a topic of discussion?
I have no doubt that that's going to be a topic of discussion. You know, there are key industries that need to be addressed here. But what's happening, and what I think the protesters in Japan have not truly thought through, is that if the TPP does happen and Japan does sign up with it, you're talking about potentially as much as a 2% expansion of GDP. Now, I would argue that after several decades of malaise, Japan desperately needs that. And you're talking about a trade bloc that globally is going to encompass some 40% of overall global trade. So this is not an insignificant moment in history.
Help us explain to our viewers. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, involves the majority of countries in the Far East, and potentially there's other countries that could sign on as well. Why is this significant? I mean, these countries already do massive amounts of trade with each other. What does the TPP bring to the table that it doesn't have right now?
The TPP is like the early days of the negotiation for the EU. There were lots of tariffs, there was lots of protectionist sentiment in amongst the various countries. What's going to happen with the TPP, if they pass it, is that you're going to have broader access to a much wider scale market. So, for example, Vietnam, which has key labor and distribution network, would gain access to the Chinese markets. Malaysia may gain access to the United States market. It's going to allow increased competition. Now, naturally, that's a scary thing because, again, you're talking about industries that have been protected for an awful long time. But it's significant. Protection never works, and if Japan does not join this particular organization, I think it's de facto admission that its economy is beyond repairable. That would not be good.
When the president leaves Japan and to honor his other destinations, in your view, what would you say would be a success? What announcement are you looking for?
I'm looking for, albeit not progress, I'm looking for Prime Minister Abe and President Obama to make a mutually assurative statement that they're watching out for each other's interests. I would expect them to extend an olive branch to all of the nations potentially involved, including China, because there is a school of thought that says if you work with China, then there's an awful lot to gain. But if you clearly try to butt heads with China, the numbers are simply going to mean you're on the losing end of the stick.
You're basically referencing a lot of the military disagreements between the regional neighbors there. I mean, the U.S., President Barack Obama is there. He's got to be careful. He doesn't want to obviously offend any of the neighbors, but at the same time, he's an ally of Japan. That makes it hard for him, doesn't it?
Well, I think so. You know, clearly the president is under a lot of strain here in the United States. He's been highly and sharply criticized for his handling on the Ukrainian crisis. He's got now to deal with Japan and China, who have got conflicts of their own. China has got one going with the Philippines. South Korea has got one going with North Korea. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on the table here, and you know, this is going to test what is clearly left of the United States resolve as a global power.
There's certainly a lot of issues to work out. I want to thank you for your time, Keith Fitz-Gerald.